Recently, I went to Goodwill BINS and picked up this jacket without realizing it was the biggest jacket in the world. But it's super warm and I really like it, so I want to see if I can refashion it to fit me. The two main things I'm going to attempt to do are to shorten the sleeves and take in the sides of the body. Since resewing the cuffs with the Velcro closure would be really challenging, I'm going to keep them as is and shorten the sleeves from the top instead. Same with the hem of the body because I want to keep things as simple as possible. To remove the sleeves on both the outer shell and the lining, you could cut or seam rip, but I tend to seam rip to preserve as much of the fabric as possible. Also, I marked the left sleeve so the cuff closures would line up properly when I sewed the jacket back together. Now I see why this jacket is so warm. It's lined with this thick batting material. One thing I like about upcycling is learning about how clothes are constructed. The next step is to try on the jacket and mark it in 3 places, starting with the shoulder seam where the sleeve should start. I wanted this jacket to be oversized, so I marked it just a little bit under the shoulder to give it a drop shoulder. The second mark is for the position of the underarm seam. Again, this is going to be quite oversized. Less oversized than the original, but still oversized. The last mark is near the hem, where the side seam will meet the original side seam. To mark the armhole, I drew a right angle from the shoulder seam and a 90-degree angle to the underarm mark to create a rectangular shape. Then I rounded the curve, starting about halfway down the long side of the rectangle. To mark the side seam, I drew a line from the underarm to the mark on the side seam. I actually ended up redoing the side seams and hem later, so if I were to do this again, I just cut the side seam straight from the armhole down to the hem. To cut the jacket, I pinned it in place so the lining wouldn't slip around, but in retrospect, I don't think it was necessary. After removing the lining and the batting, I used the cut sections as patterns for the other side. I've been searching for a simple way to create a sleeve from an armhole for some time, and after some experimentation I came up with this idea. I'm not sure how successful it will be, but the beauty of buying clothes from the Goodwill bins is that I can afford to experiment. So first I traced around the armhole using a piece of cardboard to stabilize the paper. Then I made sure the paper was aligned with the angle of the shoulder seam and traced around the armhole. After cutting out the armhole shape, I used it to create the sleeve pattern. I aligned the pattern to the edge of the paper, which represents the fold. Then I started tracing the shape of the armhole until I got to the part where the curve started to straighten out. Then I made a mark and flipped the pattern and continued tracing the underarm part of the pattern and marked where it ended. Then I smoothed out the curve. After cutting along the line, I had a pattern for my sleeve. The sleeve pattern should look like a bell curve cut in half, and the width of the sleeve pattern should equal or be just a bit longer than the width of the armhole pattern. Then I tried the jacket on and measured the length from the shoulder to the wrist plus ½ inch extra for seam allowance, which for me was 21½ inches. After folding the sleeve in half and making sure the shell and the lining were nice and flat, I placed the sleeve pattern on the fold at 21.5 inches. I wanted a drop shoulder sleeve for my jacket, but for a regular fit, you could place the pattern at an angle like the original sleeve. In my case, the sleeve was the same width as the pattern, which saved me the trouble of having to trim and sew the side seams. Then I marked along the top of the pattern, cut along the line, and repeated with the other sleeve. The easiest way to sew the seams would have been to sew the lining and the shell together, then finish the seams with a binding, but I don't think my machine could get through that many layers of fabric, so I decided to sew the jacket and the lining separately. To sew the side seams of the outer shell, I sewed on the wrong side of the fabric with the right sides facing each other. I started on the original seam at the hem, then continued up to the armhole using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. There was no need to finish the seam because of the lining. Then I did the same thing on the other side. At this point, I tried on the jacket and realized the side seams were not working, and I'd have to redo the sides and the hem. So I picked open the bottom section of the side seams and about 6 inches of the hem on either side of the side seam. Then I marked a new sew line and cut it out. Next, I re-sewed the side seam, making sure to back tack where I joined the original seam. Then I recut one side of the lining using the outer shell as a guide and repeated it on the other 3 sections of lining to make sure the shell and the lining pieces were the same size. If I were to do this again, I'd simply cut through the hem at the start, so keep that in mind if you have a similar project. After making sure the left sleeve was on the left side of the jacket, with the jacket inside out, I placed the sleeve with the right side out so that the 2 right sides were facing each other. Next, I pinned the armhole of the shell to the sleeve of the shell, starting near the underarm seam so that the extra fabric from the sleeve would be near the shoulder. Then I sewed the sleeve to the armhole using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and repeated with the other sleeve. Next, I unpicked the rest of the hem in order to make it easier to sew the lining. Since I already started opening the hem, the easiest way to get at the lining seams was to simply unpick the rest of the hem. To sew the side seams, I lined up the batting with the edges of the lining on both sides. Then I sewed the front and back together, making sure to catch the batting and the lining in one pass. Attaching the sleeves was a little tricky, but I found pinning them carefully really helped. First, I pulled up the lining to access the armhole from the hem. Then I aligned the underarm seams on both the lining and the armhole and pinned them together with the right sides facing. I knew this could get really tricky between the lining, the batting, and sewing at awkward angles, so I pinned the sleeve very carefully all the way around the armhole. Then I sewed it into place. This was a little bit awkward, and I had to wrangle the fabric a bit, but it wasn't too hard. Once I sewed around the armhole, I back-tacked to secure the seam and repeated on the other side. Once both sleeves were sewn in, I folded up the hem and pinned it in place. Then I re-sewed it, staying as close as possible to the original sew line. And that's it, we're done. So here's what inspired this whole oversized jacket thing: the Dolce & Gabbana Cool Girls fashion show. And here's my result: the Goodwill BINS edit. Will I wear it with my lingerie in the middle of winter? Probably not. But it is a super warm, super cozy jacket, and for about $10 and some time on the sewing machine, it turned out better than I expected. And I'll definitely wear it, so I hope this inspires you to try your own refashioning project. Thanks for watching, and happy upcycling!